It's a great honor for me to introduce my friend R. James Woolsey to you tonight to speak on the subject of energy in the 21st century, a subject to which he's given a great deal of attention and thought. He was educated at Stanford at the bachelor's level and then at the master's level at Oxford, where he was a Rhodes Scholar, and then he has a law degree from Yale Law School. He entered public life early, being, I think, probably the youngest undersecretary of the Navy ever, and he has served a number of years, I think some 12 plus years, 5 different stints in different departments and activities under 2 Republican administrations and 2 Democratic administrations. He's well known in legal circles, as you might guess, and in business circles. He happens to be the president of Woolsey Partners, LLC, and he's a venture partner in Lux Capital Management. But his primary, I think, claim to fame is he's the iconic public servant. And we'll have an opportunity to learn today because of that incredible record he has of public servant. I earlier mentioned in the Department of the Navy, he was in McNamara's favorite think tank, and he's been on various commissions on terrorism, defense management, and so on. And he's served on, I don't know, 4 or 5 times in the field of arms control, negotiating arrangements with the Soviet Union. So he has an extraordinary background that he brings to this occasion, and I'm delighted to give to you R. James Woolsey.
Thanks, Joe. It's a pleasure. Ron, thanks. It's a real pleasure to be introduced by an old and good friend. I'm honored to be here this evening, but to tell you the truth, since I spent 22 years as a Washington lawyer and then some time out at the CIA in the Clinton administration, so I'm actually honored to be invited into any polite company for any purpose at all. Now, an issue always comes up in a question period whenever I make remarks, and so I've learned to kind of try to deal with it ahead of time. And it always comes out somewhat like this. You were a lawyer and in other government jobs, and you were only out at the CIA 2 years. Did you participate in any of those, covert operations? And the answer is, yeah, I did once, and this is a small and discreet group, and I think I can share it with you. My wife and I were classmates at Stanford, and in the fall of 1993, our reunion was coming up. And I'd been in the CIA job about 8 months. It's a 24/7 job. She was the chief operating officer of the National Academy of Sciences. That's a 24/7 job. We decided we're going to cash in the old frequent flyer miles, take 3 days off, go see the homecoming game, see old friends, forget about work for a little bit. Well, the first thing that happened is my chief of security at the CIA came in to see me, and he said, "Mr. Director, I'm afraid when you go to California, you and Mrs. Woolsey are going to have to go on separate planes. We can't have anybody named Woolsey on your plane." And I said, "But wait, if I'm on it, I'm named Woolsey." And he said, "Oh, no, sir, you have to fly an alias." And of course, my first thought was, uh-oh, there go the frequent flyer miles. So we take my wife out to Dulles Airport, put her on her first class frequent flyer seat. She takes off and heads to San Francisco. And my 2 security men and I go get on another United flight. They stop by the cockpit in those simpler times and show the pilot and the chief flight attendant that they're carrying weapons and the cards that say they're authorized to do so by the federal government. We go back to the back row of coach, right in front of that barrier where you can't even lean back. I'm wedged in between these two big guys in the middle seat, 6.5 hours flying to San Francisco. We get off, we're walking down the jetway, and the flight attendant comes over and whispers something to one of my two security men, whose nickname for about 6 reasons was Rock. I had not seen Rock even smile in the 8 months he had been on my security detail. And when the flight attendant whispered to him, he just cracked up. So naturally I was curious. We were walking down the jetway, I said, Rock, what's so funny? He said, you know what she just said? She said, you know, I've been on these flights for 20 years, and that's the politest and best behaved prisoner that we have ever had on. But look at it this way, mission accomplished, got covertly to California, that was the objective, right? Well, one of the things that's wrong with the energy debate is that everybody is always talking past one another. First thing to know about it is that there are several smaller energy systems. We have 2 big energy systems in the country. We have the electric grid and we have transportation. And the electric grid has virtually no oil connected with it. Way under 1% of our electricity is produced by burning oil. It was different back in the 1970s. In the 1970s, if you put in a nuclear power plant or a coal plant or solar farm, and shut down an oil-fired power plant, you were replacing oil with those systems. No longer. So one of the first things you know when somebody says, the problem is foreign oil, and we're going to solve it by erecting wind farms and solar, is that they don't have the foggiest idea of what they're talking about, or they don't care that they are 99% irrelevant. Okay? The other problem you run into rather frequently is people who have a great deal of confidence in the cap and trade system, which was being considered by the Congress. The Obama administration got it past the House of Representatives, but not the Senate. Lots and lots of people said if we just put a price on carbon, we're going to solve the foreign oil problem. The only problem is that $1 a ton of CO2 in that cap and trade system was a penny at the pump. A $25 price for CO2, which is what the system was going to try to work toward, would have added only 25 cents a gallon to gasoline, would have had virtually no impact. And we also have the idea that you can make oil go down in price if we produce it domestically. Well, that would be the case if there were a real market in oil. There is not. International oil trade, the world oil market, is run by a cartel, otherwise known in American criminal law as a conspiracy in restraint of trade, called OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. There's one worldwide market to a first approximation, a little bit of differences for sulfur content and so forth. But if we drill baby drill here and produce at tens of dollars a barrel, which is what it would cost, what it does cost, whether in the Gulf or Alaska, the Saudis produce for $2 a barrel. OPEC, which they are effectively the leader of, has about 78% of the world's oil. It produces only 1/3 of the world's oil because, repeat after me, it is a conspiracy in restraint of trade. So if we drill baby drill here and sell that oil on the international market, we can improve our balance of payments. It's not a worthless thing to do. We borrow, at today's oil prices, about $1 billion a day just to import oil. It'd be better if we only had to borrow $900 million a day. But it's not the way we're going to solve the basic issue. People say, well, then let's drill in Canada. Let's have a pipeline. Okay, you know, that can add something to the international market. But the international market is run by OPEC. Whether the new oil comes in from us or from Canada, in a real market, added supply would lower the cost. It's not what happens in OPEC. OPEC decides whether the cost is going to go up or down for their own purposes. Now, up until the 1970s, the international oil market was run by the Texas Railroad Commission. And as an Okie, I've got to say that the Texans did a good job. When I was growing up in Oklahoma and learning to drive in the 1950s, oil was about $2, $3 a barrel. Gasoline was 20, 25 cents a gallon. Life was good. The Texans did a good job. From the 1970s on, that's gone. OPEC now does it. And we will not be able to resuscitate the days of the 1950s or 60s or early 70s when our Texas friends ran the international oil market. Those days are gone with the wind. So by drilling for more, or having the Canadians drill for more, we add a bit to the international market, and we can improve our balance of payments a little bit. That's essentially it. So these two separate energy markets have today very, very little to do with one another. One just cannot fix our international, our foreign oil problem by doing things with electricity. Electricity has problems of its own. The electric grid, it's called by the National Academy of Engineering, is the most remarkable invention of the 20th century. It is extraordinary. We generate electricity all over the country. It goes on the distribution lines, telephone poles, essentially to get to the transmission. It's stepped up with transformers, transmitted great long distances, stepped down with transformers, goes into the distribution grid someplace else. All the while, people are sitting at computers deciding whether they're going to save a quarter of a cent by buying Seattle electricity while they're in Florida instead of Maine electricity. It's all operating all the time. It's an extraordinary invention. But it has several rather serious problems. And I'm going to talk about the problems of electricity and the problems of oil through the eyes of the three gentlemen that are mentioned in the title of this speech. Now, why would I say could Muir, Patton, and Gandhi agree on a way to approach energy? It's a summary way of talking about a set of values. Muir, John Muir, the founder of the Sierra Club, Teddy Roosevelt's friend, the father in many ways of the national park system. John Muir, in my thinking, is all about clean and green, whether it is CO2, because he's worried about climate change, or whether it is local pollutants. Muir is my spokesman for wanting to have our environment clean, and that's one thing that is important about energy. For example, Muir is worried about coal because it has a lot of impurities in it as well as a lot of carbon. He is worried now about nuclear power. Muir was getting a little soft on nuclear power up until Fukushima because he liked the idea that it didn't emit carbon. He liked the idea that it was stable. But now he's noticed that we have 2 nuclear power plants in the United States right on top of the San Andreas Fault, and we may not be entirely free forever from some of the types of problems we saw in Japan this spring. And my Muir anyway, is getting slightly colder feet about nuclear power. What's got him interested, at least as far as fossil fuels go, is the putting together of 2 technologies that only have gotten joined up within the last 2 or 3 years. Namely, horizontal drilling for natural gas, drill down a mile or so, turn, and then drive to go out a mile more in a gas shale formation. The horizontal drilling and the so-called hydrofracturing, often abbreviated fracking, sort of like meeting somebody at Fuddruckers restaurant. Be careful how you say it. But fracking is a remarkable technology. You blast water, concentrated water, with little bits of sand in it, and sometimes other chemicals, sometimes not. into a gas shale formation, loosens up the gas, the little bits of sand hold the shale apart, and the gas comes out. We've increased by a factor of 2 or 3 our estimates of the gas we have in the United States in the last couple of years as a result of the progress that's been made in hydrofracturing. There's some environmental controversy about it. We can deal with those in questions if you want, but I think the problems, and they're relatively small, are relatively easily dealt with by modern technology. It's not a new idea to hydrofracture a well. In the history of the world, there have been about 4 million oil and gas wells drilled. 3 million of them drilled in Texas and Oklahoma. 750,000 of those were hydrofractured going back to the 1950s. So it's not as if we're subjecting the earth to some brand new notion, but you do have to do it right. And some of the early hydrofracturing may not have been done right. Muir is mildly and cautiously optimistic about fracking because he has turned his attention with respect to making the electric grid and the production of electricity clean. He's turned his attention a bit from nuclear and a bit toward natural gas. Up until now, natural gas has not been used much for what's called baseload in generating electricity. It's not the steady supply of electricity that you have over a long period of time. That's generally done by coal, by nuclear, and by power systems related to dams. But gas can be turned on and off easily. It's easy to get it at all sorts of different places because we have gas mains all over the country. So to be able to deal with peak electricity requirements, like on hot August afternoons, you can turn on the gas, then turn it off when you don't need it anymore. And since it was kind of expensive, it followed the price of oil for many years, that was an appropriate use for it. But hydrofracturing separates gas from oil. Gas now is going for about 1/4 the price of oil in equivalent energy terms. So it's plausible at those prices to use it for baseload, to use it for the constant supply, more or less, of the electricity that we need. And that lets Muir lobby the Environmental Protection Agency to start closing down some of the old coal-fired power plants, which produce extremely dirty emissions. And it lets him solve his problem of worrying about, are we going to have an American Fukushima if we stay long-term with heavy dependence on nuclear power. Patton is my emblem, of course, for national security and uncompromising national security. We're not talking about a soldier statesman here, we're talking about an all-warrior. And Patton has a number of concerns about electricity, but his are really very different from Muir's. Patton is worried that this big, complicated, somewhat fragile electric grid that we've constructed is susceptible to at least 2 types of damage by malevolent enemies. Patton distinguishes between malignant and malevolent problems. He says if the power grid goes down because of weather for 4 or 5 days, that's really a shame, and it can lead to terrible accidents. It can lead to certainly a lot of discomfort. It's a malignant problem. It's a complex system that has failed in part because of cascading messes that are created by something that disturbs it, like, say, a big storm. But Patton is first and foremost worried about what he calls malevolent problems. And the electric grid is in a situation where terrorists are a lot smarter than tree branches. They don't have to wait until a tree branch touches a power line and knocks power out for several million people for several days. They can decide what parts of the system they might want to attack, and some of those attacks, since this is a relatively fragile system that was never put together with the idea that it was going to be attacked, transformers and other important parts of the electric grid are unfortunately quite liable to intentional interference. We've put together the entire infrastructure of the United States, except for nuclear power plants, which are reasonably well protected, generally without a single thought being given to intentional interference. From the British burning of Washington in 1814 until 9/11, with the single really exception of Pearl Harbor, we have not had a foreign overseas enemy threat to something like the infrastructure of the United States in over 200 years. So it shouldn't be surprising that we've put together our infrastructure without thinking that much about whether someone was intentionally going to disrupt it. But we have 18 critical infrastructures in the United States: food, water, sewage, etc. All 17 of the others depend on electricity. If the electric grid goes down, they all go down. And we are not back in the 1970s pre-internet web. We are back in the 1870s pre-electric grid, and none of us has enough plow horses or water pump handles. So Patton is worried about terrorist threats, and he's especially worried about hackers. Because another thing that we did, not thinking about vulnerabilities, was when the Y2K changes were made to a lot of our infrastructure back in just before 2000 and in 2000, people said, you know, this new thing, the internet, hey, why don't we operate the control systems for our utilities over? And we'll send all the signals to turn up the power and turn down the power and everything over the internet. It's free. Everything's connected. Isn't that a good idea? Well, the internet was put together as a way to have a kind of an email system among a group of academics put together by the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, not by Al Gore. So it was called the DARPANet, not the GoreNet. And it was put together by a group of folks who kind of came of age in the 1960s and thought that the world was a beautiful place and everybody will be nice. And you know, not everybody on the web is nice. There are hackers, there are foreign intelligence services, China and Russia. There are a lot of folks who are not nice on the grid, on the web. And if the control systems for the electric grid run across the web as they do, and hackers can get into them and take parts of them down, we have yet a second security malevolent problem that Patton is quite worried about. So it's not so much the fuel as the grid itself that worries Patton, and justifiably. By the way, we do not have a foreign supply problem with respect to electricity. We only have that with respect to oil. Electricity in the U.S. comes from coal, natural gas, hydropower, dams, and nuclear. We buy a little bit of our natural gas from Canada, but we are not in the same situation that Europe is in with Russia controlling their natural gas. We do not have a foreign energy supply problem with respect to electricity. We have a foreign supply problem with respect to oil, which we'll get to in just a second. But in the circumstances we're in, Patton has a real point about these twin vulnerabilities from physical interference, especially with transformers and hacking. And part of what we have to think about as we think about what kind of an energy system we need is not just that we want it to be clean. We can't just worry about Muir's concerns. We have to make it secure, and it's not now. So we have to also listen to Patton. And then there's a third gentleman. People probably wonder what in the world would Mahatma Gandhi have to say about the American electric grid. Well, he would probably have been more interested in the grid in the developing world, But one thing he would point out, if he were still here, is that the satellite photos at night of sub-Saharan Africa from, say, the early 1970s show some spots of bright light around Lagos, Nigeria, and some spots of bright light around Johannesburg, South Africa, and that's about it. South of the Sahara, at night, the continent is dark. There is very little electricity, was then. Well, but we've had over 40 years, we've had the World Bank, and we've had all sorts of people putting up big power systems, right? Well, they kind of plan to, but Gandhi would point out it just doesn't happen. So if you take a satellite photo of sub-Saharan Africa at night now, it looks pretty much exactly like the one from 40 years ago. The bottom 2 billion in the world, people that Gandhi is most concerned about, live largely without electricity, or if they do have electricity, it's because they can take a gas can and walk several miles to a village, buy a little bit of diesel, very expensive, come back and use it in a generator, perhaps to run a small refrigerator for medicine for their animals or whatever. But they are not living with the benefits of electricity as most are. And Gandhi has a real problem with big electrical systems that never really get to the village and never really help the people who most need it. So our electric grid has three rather substantial critics in these three gentlemen. Is there any resolution of those vectors that can move us in a positive direction with respect to electricity? I wrote an article with two very able co-authors a couple of years ago called No Strings Attached, Moving Toward a Distributed Generation of Electricity. By distributed, one means generating electricity at lots of small facilities, some of them located perhaps very close to a load, close to a factory that needs electricity, close to a farm that needs electricity. And one of the best ways to do that, in the United States anyway, is with natural gas, because we have it pretty much everywhere, and a lot of pipes and mains make it possible for it to be used that way. It can be supplemented with renewables. The problem with the renewables, especially solar and wind, is that they're irregular, and so you can't use them now for base load. You might be able to once storage improves, but it's not cheap enough yet to do that. So solar is kind of good because it's going to be able to generate electricity most when it's really needed on very hot days for air conditioners and the like. But the baseline load is probably going to be carried by natural gas. And the more distributed it is, the more it's generating electricity in lots of places near where it's needed, rather than in single big facilities and trying to transmit the electricity long distances. If you do that, you make it possible to operate just in what's called the distribution grid. The distribution grid is what's on telephone poles. The transmission grid is what's on the big steel towers. Think of the transmission grid as the interstate highway system. The distribution grid is the city streets and the county roads. If you can stay on the electrical equivalent of the city streets and the county roads, you make yourself less vulnerable to being taken down, a la Patton's concerns, by hackers or by transformers getting blasted by terrorists. You're staying kind of within your neighborhood. And you may not be able to get all the electricity you need. If you have a aluminum plant on the outskirts of town that takes a lot of electricity, you probably don't have that being generated locally, but the difference between having half of what your house normally uses for electricity and having nothing is gigantic. It's the difference between civilization and not having civilization. Because if it's nothing, then all 17 of those other infrastructures go down, and you don't have water, you don't have food, you don't have anything else. Gandhi likes the idea of distributed generation, as does Patton, because he sees anything that might be in the control of the village as something that is really going to be in the hands of the people and benefit the people. Gandhi on his marches used to carry with him a charkha, Indian spinning wheel. It's on the middle of the Indian flag. It has some religious significance, but what he was doing would be to stop every day for a couple of hours and spin cotton with tens, hundreds of thousands of people standing around watching him spin cotton. What's he trying to communicate to the people of India in the 1940s? He was communicating, don't plant cotton, pick it, and ship it off to England. Spin it into cloth yourself. A modern consultant would say, move up the value chain. That makes you more independent. It makes you richer at the village level. It builds community. Don't let people run things from outside. Parts of Africa, part of the Congo had a big electric grid, and what Mobutu, one of the worst dictators Africa has ever had, would do with the big electric grid is whenever there was a town that might revolt against him, he'd turn off their electricity. That's the sort of thing Gandhi would be trying to stop. Let people generate electricity locally. Once storage becomes more affordable than it is today, either in batteries or in heated salt or in heated water, there are all sorts of technologies being developed. And I think we're talking 2, 3, 4 years, not 50. Once you get a factor of 10 improvement in the cost of storage, then you really have no strings attached, because you can put solar and natural gas generation at a lot of different places near where the load is needed, and let the solar operate in the daytime, but store up heat or store up electricity and then use it also at night when you need it. We're talking about a very fundamental change to go to no strings attached for the electric grid. But it's a change which would take, of course, time. It's a change which would be evolutionary. It's not a change where you wipe out the grid and put something else in. But the direction we evolve, the direction we move, either can be one that is far more secure than what we have now, considerably cleaner than what we have now, and more conducive all over the world, if people follow our lead, to local responsibility and local control, and really having affordable energy rather than having just the promise of something maybe being transmitted from a huge power station halfway across Africa. What about the other energy system we have? Transportation. Transportation, unlike electricity, is totally dominated by one fuel, petroleum-based fuels. In the United States, about 97, 98% of transportation rolls on petroleum in one way or another. In the world as a whole, it's about 94, 95%. But we have, my three consultants, Muir, Patton, and Gandhi, have some real problems with our transportation petroleum system today. And let's talk about just a few of them. Muir, for example, is very, very worried about the fact that we spend only about $30 or $40 billion a year on coal. We spend between 700 billion and $1.4 trillion a year on oil. So there's a lot more oil that is putting pollutants, CO2, as well as local pollutants, into the atmosphere than there is with coal. One thing Muir is getting very concerned about is what's called aromatics. When you drive with gasoline, you have to have the octane boosted because modern engines, the compression ratios can't deal with low octane fuels, and gasoline alone doesn't have enough octane. We used to add lead to it back until the 1970s, when people got sufficiently concerned about lead being carcinogenic that we got the lead out. But unfortunately, they replaced it with benzene, toluene, and xylene, the aromatics. Highly carcinogenic, highly dangerous with respect to various pulmonary diseases. Boyden Gray, who was first President Bush's White House counsel and the second President Bush's ambassador to the European Union, has written a very scholarly and thorough article about benzene, toluene, and xylene. He says the cost to the country of using those to enhance octane, and they're about a quarter to a third of all of our gas tanks on all our cars. He said by using those, you're adding about $200 billion a year to costs in the United States from added medical costs and tens of thousands of shortened lives. As I say, Boyden Gray is not an arm waver. He worked those numbers very carefully. So Muir has more than just CO2 and climate change. He's worried about that and all that oil does on that front. But he's especially worried about very specific pollutants, and he has no interest at all in continuing with gasoline if you have to enhance the octane, and if you're going to enhance the octane that way. Patton. Patton's problems with oil. Well, with oil at about $70 or $80 a barrel, we borrow $1 billion a day just to import oil. When oil is priced where it was in 2008, $147 a barrel, we borrow about $2 billion a day just to import oil. We import about half our oil, sometimes a bit more, sometimes a bit less. So we either are spending about $350 billion a year, borrowing it from the Chinese and the Saudis and others in order to pay it to OPEC, or if OPEC decides it wants oil prices up around $140 a barrel, we'll be borrowing about $700 billion a year from the Chinese and the Saudis in order to import oil from OPEC. Words cannot describe how Patton feels about that. In 2006, Al-Qaeda attacked Abqaiq. Abqaiq is in northeastern Saudi Arabia. It's the largest oil facility in the world. About 3/4 of Saudi crude passes through Abqaiq. Al-Qaeda tried to blow up the sulfur clearing towers with a truck bomb. Happily, they rigged their bomb wrong. Had they succeeded in blowing up the sulfur clearing towers there, through which about 3/4 of Saudi crude passes, they probably would have been down for at least a year or so. Oil would almost certainly have gone way above $200 a barrel for that amount of time. So any morning when you wake up and there has not been a terrorist attack on a large oil facility in the Middle East, that's a good day. But it could change. There's another little problem that Patton notes with respect to oil. It's not just an oil problem. Economists tend to call it a resource curse because it has occurred at different countries in the past with respect to gold and any other commodity to which a huge amount of economic rent attaches. Now, economic rent, if you are the Saudis and you lift oil for $2 a barrel and you sell it for 90, you're getting a lot of economic rent. That is, return that is not really limited by a normal return on capital and labor. If you live in an autocratic or dictatorial country run by a tiny elite, and you come into a large amount of oil and you can lift it for a few dollars a barrel and sell it for many tens of dollars a barrel, what tends to happen is that the elite gets richer and more entrenched. Now, if a nice country like Canada or Norway discovers a lot of oil, they're democracies, they have mature economies that do other things, they don't turn into dictatorships, they just get richer. But a dictatorship or autocratic kingdom that comes into this huge amounts of rent entrenches its power elite. What is some evidence of that? There are 22 countries in the world for whom over 60% of their income comes from oil or oil and gas. All 22 are dictatorships or autocratic kingdoms. Of the 9 countries in the world that are the largest oil exporters, 8 of them are dictatorships or autocratic kingdoms. Only nice Norway is out of place in there. Canada's 10th, so 8 out of 10 or 8 out of 9. So we are not doing much, Patton says, for peaceful borders, democracies getting along with one another, etc., by entrenching all of these dictatorships through paying huge sums for their oil. There's another feature Patton is perturbed about. He says that Lawrence Wright, who wrote a very fine book called The Looming Tower about 9/11 and Al-Qaeda, says in there that there are approximately 1 to 2% of the world's Muslims in Saudi Arabia. That 1 to 2% controls approximately 90% of the world's Islamic institutions, including schools. So what is being taught in many of those schools is not the open, generous, tolerant form of Islam that's typical, say, in Indonesia. What's being taught is the Wahhabi doctrines of Saudi Arabia coming out of the Arabian desert. Give you one idea of the character of some of those beliefs. Prince Nayef is the brother of King Abdullah. He's about 10 years younger. He's in his mid-70s. And after Prince Sultan died here a few weeks ago, Prince Nayef was elevated, and he's now the crown prince and will likely be the next king of Saudi Arabia when Abdullah dies. And Abdullah's had 3 operations this year. He's not on his last legs, but he is at risk. What would be the character of what's being taught in the schools and the attitude toward the West, and say, if Prince Nayef is king of Saudi Arabia? Prince Nayef is the interior minister, and he's the head of the religious police. And to give you an idea of Prince Nayef's views, back in 2001, 2002, there was a fire in a girls' school in Mecca. This was in the Saudi press for one day and then pulled out, but people who follow it copied it, and this was the story. Fire in a girls' school. The Saudi first responders showed up, the firefighters, and they were putting out the fire and getting the girls out of the school, as they should. And then Prince Nayef's religious police showed up. They were first responders too, in a way. Prince Nayef's first responders fought off the firefighters to get the firefighters out of there, and then captured all of the girls who had run out of the school and threw them back in the burning schools because they didn't have their veils on right. That's the next king of Saudi Arabia, in all likelihood. General Patton thinks we might have some problems with it. If you wonder, as you're driving around sometime, who's paying for this Saudi-based religious instruction that focuses on these kinds of beliefs, which include, by the way, the genital mutilation of women, include so-called honor killings, of a father killing his daughter, and on and on. Who's paying for that to be taught somewhere? Here's what you need to do in order to get a feel for that. As you pull into the filling station to fill up your tank, try to remember to do what I try to do. Reach up before you get out your billfold or your purse and get your credit card. Reach up and turn the rear view mirror couple of 3 inches till you're looking into your own eyes. Now you know who is paying for that set of values to be communicated to much of the youth of that part of the world. So Patton, to put it mildly, is not inclined to stay with oil at all. Gandhi says, look, they have over 3/4 of the oil and they're only selling 1/3 of the market. They're hoarding it in order to drive the price up. If you think you have problems in the United States at $80 or $90 a barrel oil, what about my friends in Bangladesh? How are they going to get their goods to market in an old truck that gets terrible mileage with gasoline or oil that costs a derivative of close to $100 a barrel oil? So all 3 of my friends, Muir, Patton, and Gandhi, are extremely interested in moving away from oil. How might they do that? How might we do that? I'll close with this. There are 4 fuels today that are cheaper to drive on than oil. First of all, electricity, about 2 cents a mile. Costs a lot to buy the battery for the electric car, but once you have the battery, the electricity is comparatively very cheap to drive on. The other is natural gas. Natural gas is about 1/4 of oil's price on an equal energy basis. So these buses that are driving on natural gas or delivery trucks and so forth, they're doing a lot better in terms of operating costs. But it is also the case that it takes a several $1,000 modification to convert a bus or a truck to drive on natural gas or to be an electric vehicle. So we don't have an infrastructure that can use natural gas or can use electricity in large volumes quickly. There are, however, 2 other fuels that are, one is slightly cheaper than gasoline and one is considerably cheaper than gasoline, and they're both alcohols. The one that is considerably cheaper than gasoline is methanol, which is wood alcohol. We've made it for hundreds of years. It's your washer fluid in your car. It's used in all sorts of industrial uses. And methanol can be used as a fuel for our gasoline-powered vehicles today quite readily with a few very minor modifications to a car. General Motors says it's $70 a car. Most people I know who've looked at it carefully think it's a couple of tens of dollars a car, but it's a couple of different kinds of O-rings and a different kind of plastic in the fuel line and some software. It's negligible. All cars exported to Brazil have to be able to drive on gasoline and ethanol. Next year, all cars exported to China will have to be that way. About 15% of American cars are that way with ethanol, grain alcohol. But making it available for wood alcohol too is simple. So if you could do what Brazilians can do and pull into a filling station and look at the pump that has gasoline in it and look at the pump that in their case has ethanol in it, decide which one you want to buy, it's a lot harder for OPEC to dictate what you are going to spend on transportation. And if you have the ability to choose between 3, methanol, ethanol, and gasoline, you don't want ethanol because you're worried about food versus fuel. Okay, don't buy it, buy methanol, or go ahead and buy gasoline. But if nobody can order you what to do, the cartel is, for all practical purposes, broken. And Brazil and China, I think, are leading the way by requiring flexible fuel vehicles to be their imports. And I think we could make very rapid progress doing the same thing. The situation is not something we can take time to fix. When oil hits $125 a barrel, approximately half the wealth in the world is in the hands of OPEC, in oil and national sovereign wealth funds and the rest. This is not something we can sit and fiddle around about. But if you want to move toward alternative fuels that are available now and can be used in cars virtually the way they are now, and producing methanol, we produce it from natural gas. So it takes advantage of the hydrofracturing and the low price of natural gas today. If we can do that, we can begin to do something to match the no strings attached distributed generation approach for electricity, match it with oil. And the way I think we should think of it is this. For thousands of years, salt was a strategic commodity. It was the only way to preserve food until the 19th century when canning was invented, and then after that it was the only way to preserve meat. Roman soldiers were paid in salt. The word salary comes from salt. If your country or your region had a salt mine, you were a big deal. Countries were going to war over salt mines in Latin America until the 1880s. Salt, up through almost the end of the 19th century, was really a powerful commodity. Then, Edison and Tesla invent the electric grid, and before we know it, cities in Europe and the US are starting to have appliances in houses, including refrigerators. The refrigerators have small freezers, even the early ones. And it turns out that meat that has been frozen and thawed is not only cheaper than meat that's been soaked in expensive salt brine, it tastes a lot better. So within a relatively few years, electricity, a new technology, effectively destroyed salt as a strategic commodity. Didn't destroy salt, period. Some people still use salt to preserve meat, use salt for other purposes, still a market in salt, but I'll wager that when you went to dinner this evening, if there was a salt shaker on the table, you didn't pick it up and look at it and say, I wonder where this came from. I wonder if we're salt independent. No, you don't care. Unless you're Long and Morton's, salt is boring. What we need to do to oil is make it boring. Thank you.
We do have time for a few questions. We have a microphone near the back of the room in this aisle. We invite you to line up there, and Mr. Woolsey will be happy to take your questions. Please make sure it is a question and fairly brief so that we can get as many as possible in just a few minutes.
Shoot.
All right, thank you, first of all, for coming to campus here. We enjoyed your remarks. My question is regarding the electrical grid. You talked about the security and its vulnerability to hackers. Mm-hmm. How would you secure the grid against electromagnetic pulse?
I didn't have time to get to that, but you're right, it's the third one. Electromagnetic pulse we first knew about because of some Russian and American, the last actually above ground nuclear tests in the early 60s. And whereas it didn't interfere with vacuum tubes, which were still around in some measure then, the early transistors and the like, electronics, were fried by these tests, and sometimes from some distance away and a relatively high altitude. And that started a lot of work and investigation into electromagnetic pulse. Congress, if you want to read up on this, Congress put out a report that you can find on the web about 3 years ago that's quite detailed. And the bottom line is that it is a very serious problem because you don't need to be accurate with respect to where the missile is going in order to detonate it and cause an electromagnetic pulse effect over a large area. You can fry the electronics and even perhaps big chunks of the grid by detonating the weapon at a high altitude. So it's not like the threat to the United States from accurate ballistic missiles from sophisticated countries. Let's say you had a North Korea or an Iran that wanted to take out a big chunk of the energy system in the United States. North Korea has nuclear weapons, sort of. Iran doesn't yet, knock on wood. Both countries have simple ballistic missiles, Scuds. They're kind of grown-up versions of World War II's V-2s. 50 countries, I think, have Scuds. So if you put a Scud on a fishing boat, you put a primitive nuclear warhead on the front, and haul it up to within a couple of hundred miles of the East Coast, New York, and launch it up a couple of hundred miles into near space, detonate it, you could well cause very substantial damage to the electric grid and to electronics within a very wide area. There are also other ways to produce electromagnetic pulse without having a nuclear detonation. There are devices and so forth that different governments and countries work on with respect to EMP. So you're absolutely right. It is a third danger of the big, complicated, transformer-heavy grid, transmission grid. And insofar as your electricity would consist of some solar cells and a special device that is heated up by solar and can generate electricity at night, and it's next to your house, you don't really have an electromagnetic pulse problem. The problem's created by the big grid, and you're quite right. It's a very serious one. I sometimes talk about it, but I thought Patton had probably scared you guys enough already, so I didn't add that in. Yes?
You had mentioned the debilitating dependence the United States has on oil from the Middle East. In your opinion, what are some of the immediate policy changes, political and economic, that need to occur in order to move us to those alternatives you had mentioned previously?
I think there's just one. I think that the Congress needs to require, and this is in a bill that's now before the Congress with bipartisan sponsorship in both bodies. It's called the Open Source Fuel Act, Fuel Flexibility Act, Open Source Fuel Flexibility Act. And it requires, instead of just the 15% or so of cars today that are made flexible fuel, and only flexible fuel for gasoline and ethanol, it requires an increasing by about 10% a year share of cars built to be sold in the U.S., foreign or domestic, to be, next year it'd have to be, let's say, 25% of them would have to be flex fuel, and flex fuel for methanol as well as ethanol and gasoline. So next year, 25% of new cars, year after that, 35% of the new cars, et cetera. That's being actually very easy on the car companies because this is a simple thing to do. It's done by them already for exports to Brazil, et cetera. And setting that up, giving choice to consumers, not telling them what they have to drive on, they decide, I think basically creates a market for methanol and to some extent ethanol, which is already there a bit. And all you really need is tank trucks and pumps at filling stations. You don't need pipelines. There's a methanol business in the United States today. It's delivered by tank trucks to places that fill up your windshield wiper fluid bottle and other things with methanol. So it's not that methanol is hard to make. You can make it from wood chips, you can make it from coal, but we probably wouldn't in this country because it's dirtier. But natural gas is so cheap these days, it's looking for more of a market, and methanol could be a very substantial one. I think it'd happen if the cars were just required to be flexible.
I'm
Right.
considering.
You don't want to drink methanol. If you drink a fuel, make it ethanol. It probably will really knock you for a loop because it's 200 proof vodka. But sometimes I say, and I want to stress tongue-in-cheek, that the advantage of ethanol is that tailgate parties can be a lot simpler. All you need is a long straw and a lime. Go ahead.
Okay.
I'm considering moving to Pittsburgh in the future. How concerned should I be about drinking the tap water? I guess a broader question about fracking and those kinds of problems.
Hydrofracturing or any other drilling, if done correctly, should not affect the water tables. The water aquifers are a few hundred feet down. Some places are less than 100 feet, but 100, 200, 300, 400 feet down. You drill through them, and people have been doing this since the 1860s. You drill down through casings. You drill and put the casing down the casing. Today, when you're drilling through the water table area, you're inside 6 steel casings. And what ought to happen is that you get well below where the water tables are, and then you find a gas shale formation, and you turn and you're going out horizontally looking for it, but you're a mile down and a mile away. It doesn't mean that there can never be accidents with respect to water tables. Drilling is a real science, but it's also partly an art. I grew up in the middle of that culture in Oklahoma. There are people who, like anything else, like surgeons, there are people who very rarely, if ever, make a mistake, and there are people who sometimes get a bit sloppy and may make a mistake. And I think some of the material that was collected for the documentaries on fracking about what was going on in Pennsylvania and New York may have been some of the initial efforts with people who had not done it before. But I tell you, if you drive buses down to Texas and Oklahoma, there are lots of oil field and gas field workers who can drill through water tables very easily and have been doing it all their lives. So I don't think it should be a problem. But any place where there's natural gas, shallow or deep, and often this is from shallow natural gas formations, sometimes there can be leakage into, and you have the flaming water faucet and so forth. But that's doesn't really have anything to do with fracking. What fracking, the new thing fracking requires is the water, after you blast it into the shale and bring it, and it comes back up slowly, about a quarter of it at first and then slowly over time. And it has some impurities in it from the earth, some that the company may have put there to make it work better. And what you can do is clean it up on site just enough to use it again. Because if this were a drill rig in this room for hydrofracturing, we might have as many as 10 fracking wells here. One in that corner of the room, one here, one here. I was down in Louisiana climbing all over fracking rigs a few months ago. And since you're drilling out that way and that way and that way, you can keep all your equipment, clean up equipment and everything together, and so you get the water back from this well, you take it over here, clean it up a bit, use it for that well. After you've used it for 8 or 10 wells, you do have to take it away, clean it up very thoroughly, and dispose of it in a sensible way. But there are technologies that will do that. There's a regulatory hassle with the gas companies because they want to save money and not spend as much as they should, and so there's that kind of thing that there is in all environmental work. But I don't think there's anything uniquely difficult or polluting about hydrofracturing.
You had briefly touched on carbon tax, and given the presidential capacity to make that happen and the EPA, what are the chances of that happening going forward as far as making carbon tax a reality?
I think it's pretty slim. Either a carbon tax or a cap and trade, which is basically just a tax where you can rationalize the system by letting people decide how much to spend on the system and how much to spend on the tax. I think that the real problem was that what it was oriented toward doing was cleaning up stationary sources, and the main stationary sources people wanted to clean up was coal, because natural gas didn't require much, and we don't have oil, and nuclear didn't add any, and hydro doesn't add any. So it was really about cleaning up coal. And it was drafted in such a way that it doesn't really work with respect to mobile sources like cars. Like I said, at $1 a ton of CO2 and the house-passed system was a penny a gallon at the pump. So people got kind of disillusioned about it for that reason. A lot of the environmental groups got disillusioned because it was so kind to the coal companies and their main supporters, the railroads, because about 2/3 of American railroads are used to haul coal. And the railroads and the coal companies got in there and lobbied very hard for all sorts of exemptions. And so when the smoke cleared, you weren't doing very much to clean very much up, but you had a new complicated system, and it couldn't get through the Senate anyway. And then we had an election that looks like it tilted both houses away from an interest in a price on carbon. So I think probably what's going to happen is that for fixed facilities, the expense of putting scrubbers on the old coal plants is going to drive people away from keeping those going and towards substituting natural gas. And in time, once storage improves, renewables. And you're probably not really going to need a cap and trade system or a carbon tax to move us away from coal. People say, well, then let's have an oil tax to move us away from oil. But in these days and times, convincing anybody to add a tax, I mean, given the state of the economy, is a superhuman effort. And if you already have two fuels that are cheaper than gasoline from today's oil, then just open up the cars to the use of those two fuels, and you don't really need an added tax on oil.
I wanted to ask you about foreign affairs. I know you didn't really touch on it tonight much, but I understand that you were a member of PNAC and a host of other neoconservative type think tanks, and very much a proponent of the war in Iraq. You've talked about invading Syria. You were a proponent of pushing Libya, even more so. You thought we weren't doing enough. And also talk of invading Iran. And I guess as members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, we as Christians, and I understand you being a Presbyterian, I wanted to ask you about how that goes along with something Martin Luther King said, where he said, far from being the pious injunction of utopian dreamer, the command to love one's neighbor is an absolute necessity for our survival. Love, even for enemies, is the key to the solution for the problems of our world. Jesus is not an impractical idealist, he's a practical realist. How would you respond to that? And I guess you talked about Gandhi tonight too, in regards to wars and interventions and being Christian and how we should feel about all that.
That's an excellent question. King said something else. You may know already about Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the Protestant theologian of the 20s and 30s. Bonhoeffer was a total pacifist, complete pacifist. When he went back to Germany, he studied in the United States. When he went back to Germany in the early 30s, he started speaking out strongly against Hitler. One thing led to another. He was captured and released. To make a long story short, by the middle of the war, by around 43 or so, Bonhoeffer had determined two things. One was that it was essential to the world's future to get rid of Adolf Hitler, and he was willing to join a plot to assassinate Hitler. He did join that plot. He was hanged by the Nazis a few days before the end of the war, after he was in prison. His letters are marvelous things to read. Bonhoeffer was such a pacifist that he believed that it was highly likely he was going to hell because he joined the plot to assassinate Hitler, but he thought he was called upon to do it anyway. Now, some years after that, in the early 60s, Martin Luther King Jr. was up, I think at Princeton, giving a talk. And a student stood up and said, Dr. King, you have modeled your action, political action, to challenge discrimination after Gandhi. And it is coming to be very successful. Would you say that we should always emulate Gandhi when dealing with our enemies? And King said there are two cases. He said, if your enemy has a conscience, emulate Gandhi. If he does not, emulate Bonhoeffer. That'd be my answer. When sometimes you got to fight. I think that it's not through hiding our lights under a bushel that we have been able to lead the world since 1945, when there were about 20 democracies in the world, to today where there are 120. I was chairman of the board of Freedom House for several years, and Freedom House does these calculations rating countries free, partially free, not free, et cetera, and different qualities of democracy. But basically, of the 193 countries in the world, 120 are now democracies with real elections, some corruption and so forth. But let's say like Indonesia, real elections where their ballots are counted fairly and so forth. So we've added 100 in the years since World War II. It wasn't all us, but we had a hand in it. The ones in Eastern Europe are partly because of the collapse of the Soviet Union, and that's partly because we stood up to the Soviets for all those years. Different things happened in different circumstances. But basically, I think that we've got, according to Freedom House, 45 countries that are dictatorships or autocratic kingdoms. 22 of them are oil states. So I figure if we can break 22 by getting off oil, then we just got about 23 to go.
Thank you. We appreciate your being with us this evening, and thank you for coming. We hope to see you again at our next lecture. Thank you very much.